저기 나 냠낸 제알이야. 안에 탈바다 탐제 김비고 고방 토비 출도 다른 거 람 냠낸 제알은 뭐 먹고 유변아 디나 조텔라 예중 안에 장수 전주 셈 양다 다와 세데 안 som제 인자당 저 가서 양다베 다와 디고 전에 양다베 다와세 동유도 배 셔랍세데 제사당 저기 양다베 다와 네또 곰고비 김제 사지 김제인데 아니 지게 되네 아니 양답에 따와 뒤에 아니 또 봐이나 양답에 동반이 또 봐이나 간에서 또 그래 탑람 간에서 또 그래 사지 어디는 가상도 뒤 고마시죠.
Good morning. Yesterday we continued to look at the many mental paths that one needs to cultivate within oneself in order to attain liberation from suffering. And these mental paths in our text have been condensed into just three principal aspects. And yesterday we started to look at the third, that of correct view. First we looked at the reason why we need to cultivate the correct view, and thereafter we came to look at how to cultivate the correct view.
곰고비 동인도 배다와도 곰고비 규생 가리에 람나다 당아저에 코알레 저라 아니 가리기 까비어를 람나 당아저기 다시 마리바 세디 다시 마리바디기 당아저 코알레 계기 규조 다시 마리바디레시 제산다 다시 마리바델라 때네 아니 녀모바게 디왕게 레사 데네 코알게 딘 동아 바토메 바용을 체고레스 지산 동아에 자와 용서 자와디다 다시 마리바레스 지산다 다시 마리바디 빵발라 전주 셈가제 콤바이네 다시 마리바 빵그리베스네 빵투그레스네 빵투고 마레스 닝예중 가제 콤바이네 아니 다시 마리바데 빵투고 마레스 지산다 다시 마리바 빵마투 바인자 안다 다시 마리바디 빵발라네 가르공고레스네 다 동바이 또 배다와디 공고고레스 동이마 또 바이나 다시 마리 빵투고 마레스 지산 다시 마리바 빵발라 동요 또 배다와디 공고고레스 지산다 동요 또 배다와 공고비 김제네 가려람나 아주 다시 마리바 빵고고레스 디 빵고바 인자 디 빵발라 동요 또 배셔라 메나 빵투고 메바레 디 인자다 안주 인지미시 동요 또 배셔라 공고고레스지 어두스네 가산디로.
Yesterday, when we looked at the reason why we need to cultivate the correct view, I presented that it was because in order to attain freedom from suffering, we have to eradicate the root cause that keeps us bound in samsara. No matter how powerful our body teaches, no matter how powerful our definite emergencies, these two on their own cannot eradicate the root cause of all our suffering. The root cause of all our suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. It's from grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not. All our other afflictions arise and our contaminated karma is accumulated. And thereby we remain trapped in the suffering realms of samsara. To gain lasting freedom from suffering, we have to eradicate that root cause. And the way to eradicate the root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping, is to cultivate the contrary mind, the wisdom realizing the view of emptiness. And this is why it's imperative that we cultivate the correct view.
ngoso gaya 되게 ngoso 가와 윤 차위라제를 고고로와 지난 차와디메나 차위라제메나 자위라제디 메바스도 가도고 말어 디나신 다 차위라제디 메바스 발아야 자위라제도 고고래 디니 ngoso 가와치 고고로와 지산 디네자 다지 마릭바디 빵바딜라 델라 안 전주심기 다지 마릭바딜라 ngoso 누고 말해 ngoso 누고 말해 ngoso 만네 바인자 안에 다지 마디 바도고 말해 지래 그래서 권익이 전주쌤디기 다음에 된진 마릭 받을 응어서 많이 비김제 가려나 권익 진단 가가래 진단 응어서 가와 차이가 말해 진단 응어서 가와 말해 응어서 가와 말해 이제 진단 가와대 체거를 되나 응어서 가와대 체거 뒤인자 전주쌤 공부하기 난 동의도 배시 가서다 된진 마릭 발에 뉘두고 말 응어서 뉘고 말해지.
Just like if we're cold, we have to have what's contrary to cold to eradicate it. We need heat. Without heat, one cannot eradicate the cold. Heat, the reason heat can eradicate the cold is because it is directly opposite. It's directly contradictory to what it's trying to eradicate, and therefore it's suitable to be called a direct antidote. Bodhicitta, for example, is not a direct antidote to the ignorance of self-grasping because it's not directly opposed, directly opposite, directly contrary to the ignorance of self-grasping. They have a different mode of apprehension, different way of apprehending. Therefore, bodhicitta is not directly contrary to the ignorance of self-grasping.
다진 데나 진당우소 가게는 수시네 동유티비 시랍디다 다진데 진당우소 가와래. 그래서는 다진 디게 가르친 거라서 배는 하나 중에 nga 세대 다도 주받침 바이나 nga디 강라에 모두 랑응외는 주바디 랑응외는 주바 진디거와 동유티비 시랍디기 nga디 강라에 랑응외는 주비 동바도 용으로 디니 이게 진거라 진당 하베 거랑아 독서 차려와 다진 디게 베네 풍보로 셔데 풍보 템버 주바 집에 딘진 디기 풍보디 강라에 마도 거랑외네 랑응외는 주바디 진거래. 다 풍보 동이 또 풍보 때도 되면 동방이 또 베시랍디기 풍보디 강라에 랑응외는 주비 동바도 제가 직디기 랑응외는 주바진 거 직디 랑응외는 마주바도 거와 디니 백거로 독초 차려라 데데 디니 인자다 동이 또 베시라도 곰베 다 딘진 마릭바텔 무슨이 거래스 제가디 동이 또 베 곰바이나 디 다세 마릭바디 뻥 투구요 바디 가서는 무슨 주 진당 무슨 가와래 무슨이 거래스.
In general, it's clear that wisdom and ignorance are completely contradictory. And the specific wisdom, that is the wisdom realizing emptiness, is the direct antidote, directly contradictory to the ignorance of self-grasping. This is because a consciousness of ignorance is not in accordance with reality, whereas a consciousness of wisdom is. For example, the ignorance that grasps at the aggregates grasps at them as existing truly, whereas wisdom realizes that those aggregates are empty of true existence. So therefore, there is the ignorance of true grasping, and directly opposite to that is the wisdom realizing the emptiness of true existence. So therefore, we can see that these are directly contradictory, and therefore, wisdom is the direct antidote to ignorance.
onda tongyu to pelo kom ko bi kim chen de che da na tongyu to pelo di kom ko na da tongyu to ko go re chi sa tongyu to ba la tablam ka re ne an to go re la yong de an de le ya dian jin zhe wa chu wa kim chen dian zhe ge sam da je an de ne chi ne an ko to to go re chi sa dian zhe ge sam dang go re se ji da tongyu to pe tablam de la dang bo nga de dian jin zhe wa chu bi kim chen ji ge 김제 삼당 제바제 된지게 삼당 고래 되네 삼당 발라 되네 동마이 또 투그리 해서지다 동이 두배 탑람디 된지게 삼당하디.
That was the first part of the presentation, a correct view, the why we need to cultivate the correct view. Then yesterday we came to the second part, that of how, the method to cultivate the correct view. Because in order to develop a wisdom that realizes emptiness, one needs to come to understand and meditate, integrate the understanding of reality. And this is done, as we saw yesterday, through the technique of dependent arising. Today we will come to the next part, which is the measure of having come to realize emptiness. The 10th verse. When with respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana, you see that causes and their results never deceive. You completely eradicate whichever object is focused upon, and at that time enter a path delighting the Buddhas.
Andelia Ganshi Kordi Chenam Sidida, Dangazuki, Dongbani Jepachesaki Shi, and Koshi this Pa Shigore, Sungore Denma. Ganshi Kordi Chenam Sadidua, Di Garsungores in Dongbani Jepachesaki Shi, Dongshi Digas and Shigore.
Looking at the first line, when with respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana, the phenomena of samsara and nirvana, that is the basis upon which one will investigate reality. That is the basis in which one will come, or upon which one will investigate whether they are empty of true existence.
Adelia Ganshi Korde Korvichi said, De Tarba Debasna Tarba Tam. Tarbata Tamchikimpil, Sigur, Chisa, Ganshi Korvichi, said the Korvichi loved the Anzugi, the Anzukasa, Sheba Nigeria, the Garsam Dangorasene, Anzugi, Dajiki, Jitin Kam, Sashita, La Soba, Nasa La Soba, and the Jig Chuda, Sada, Chuchunwa Shila Soba, and the men began Anzugi Pumbo Suda, and there. And there let Dene Sula, Desola Dene, and the Dunga Yada, and the Jigge, a Gu Dunga, Chabatu Dunga Sada, Dunga Didu, Shadi, the Kordiki, Korichi. Deso, Yuayagi Gudi, Kasan Shebana, Deso Yuayagi Gudi Karasin Livers in Le Latene, Le Diki, and the Go, Carson, Deso Gudan Kin Mebala Tin Joma, Judan Gudan Kin Latin Yungores, that did the Gudi Karimores, and then I took a Pumbuki. Pumbo Shabana, that Gavang Amaki Lela Teneki Gores, that said Digi, Pamanila Tenera, and Digi Dilea sometime, Tanga Pumbu Jutade, Pamanila Tene, Pami Kuda Dubal Teneru, Dea, Yaya sometime, Gawa Chimagim, Lela Tene, Gavang Amik Lela Tenegor. Just a lady young, Ganis Yungores, Lady Saya Nielia, Nyomo Balatene, Yungores. 다 녀mom바데 요네 녀mom바데 카르데 인고레스네 당 당보 나 시베가 라신 주바 짐베 나진 라신 주바 짐베 짐바데 리고레세 어두 시마지네 코르유 최대제 고 유 다견라 된데 중위 림바데 파 제바체 데네 데제바체네 도야 되라 아니 코르유 최 코르디세 코르세데 지고 코르와세데 코르유 최대게
With respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana is more usually we use the term liberation from suffering. And the phenomena of samsara, these are all our worldly phenomena, whether form or consciousness. So we can think of, for example, all objects of form, whether our body or all around us that we perceive with our sight or hearing or taste or touch, all these objects of form are included within samsara. Moreover, we think of mental objects such as the three types of suffering, the suffering of physical mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering. These too are objects of samsara, or phenomena of samsara. When one investigates, one doesn't just investigate the object, which is a result, but its causes too. And the causes, as we know, all the objects of samsara come about in dependence on causes, and these causes are the contaminated karma derived from afflictions, which have as their root cause the ignorance of self-grasping. Think of, for example, our body. So our body we know came from our parents, but our parents, for them to sleep together, this was motivated by an affliction, attachment, and that itself came from the ignorance of self-grasping.
Dine zadu chine jeba chidu kabla tanga zugi lui 되게나 가서 규단 깨를 때는 중화돼 안에 도시네 야야야 규디바 토이다 자위 탈투세데 마르가 세베가 다세 마리바데 텔레테네 도시 중위 심바데 바 균티기 땡티기 도야디 디 삼다 도야체 데네 코어 데스든 코어를 타르네 양알레 데바세 오 냥디기 치시오레 제선다 코어를 타르야디 간스용구레 랍나 타르바세데 당한주 당보 타르바세 코어를 뻥비 뻥바데 코어 함질레 탈비 류디 간스리기레 랍두 디가를 틸리기레세도 안나 람 콤발레틴 리고레스 람 냠렌체 베나가스 람들레 람 냠렌체 발레틴 리고레스 지사다 람 냠렌체 람 냠렌체 땡아 주게다 그승이 마시바네 짐바 수좀 쇠발라 소바다 되네 다음에 또 따와 또 비시라 냠렌체 발레테네 아는 코위기 묘모 빵베 빵바드라고레스 빵바도 되네 되네기 캠베 연대는 빵베 연대는 류디다 코와레 타와드 차그로 제사디 용아에데 람 냠렌체 발레틴 리고레스 다 람 냠렌체 그 람데게 아는 간스 용구레 라두 안 당봉아 주게 베네 장슈 셈로시나 당보 장슈 셈데 카르치 일레게라나 디유 잠바데 니조고바 베네 라산 남다다 곰발틴 리그레스 라산 남다 곰바데 카르티 리그레스는 잠바데 니조고발레틴 리그레스 다 잠바다 니지데 카르리그레스는 저기 안에 셈젠 탐제 안에 저기 동아래 자고도 셈베기 예중 때 잠바다 니지데 당보 라니 동아다 자되게 삼바 코베 동아래야 꾼다 동아래 자되게 예중 개발할 때네 잠바 니지 리고레스 다 코발에 예중 개데 간슬리고스는 코베 동아 꾼 통화체 꾼지 하고요도 꾼텔에 탈되게 예중 리고로 지상 코베 꾼 통화 때네 리고레스 다디 꾼 통화에 간슬리고레스는 당한 저기 개회신이 되네 저기 최슈 개회신이 아주 두수 삼당 거라서 롭든제 발에 되네 저기 퇴바제 퇴비기 되는 삼당 두시도 안퇴 개회신이 아주 납치잡 되네 봐 델레든 리고레스도 세상 대우도스네 다 코월에 탈위 진바디 균지기 진바 직제 코월에 코리아기 기위 규진바 직제 디차사 규단 겐들 때네 연구요 바데 직샹을 되네 규단 겐을 되네 연구요 바데 어두시네 심주체네 제바체제 하고야 되라 다 디소라 가시 코르위 최남 탐지 세대 고 코르위 최디소 코르디기 최디기 디소다
Not only was our conception dependent on causes, but so too our growth. Our growth too, and throughout our entire life, has been dependent on a wide variety of causes or conditions. These causes have been accumulated by afflicted minds, with as their root the ignorance of self-grasping. So this is one illustration that we're very familiar with. We need to look very broadly here, because we see in the first line it says, with respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana. So nirvana, as mentioned, is often translated as liberation. How is liberation or nirvana attained? It's through cultivating a path within one's own continuum, or to put it literally, gaining experience of the path in one's continuum. For example, training in the 6 practices of generosity, ethical restraint, and so forth. Those are causes that lead to a wide variety of good qualities, including the wisdom realizing emptiness, and therefore the result of liberation from suffering, or nirvana. Similarly, in the context of a bodhisattva striving, or a practitioner striving to become a bodhisattva, they will be wanting to create the cause of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta arises from the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. That is the cause for bodhicitta. And this is immediately preceded by the causes of love and compassion. So we see here that liberation from the sufferings of samsara, in other words, nirvana, as well as Buddhahood, come about independent on causes. Similarly, when we look at the phenomena of samsara, the faults of samsara, not only do they come about in dependence on causes, but our recognition of the sufferings of samsara, the faults of samsara, our recognition of that also comes about in dependence on causes. Firstly, we hear a number of teachings, ongoing teachings from our spiritual teacher. We reflect and we meditate on these. And in this way, we come to recognize the sufferings of samsara, and that samsara is pervaded by suffering. And thereby, we need to continue to accumulate the causes that lead to liberation. So here we see the phenomena of samsara, as well as nirvana. This all comes about in dependence on a wide variety of causes. This is crucial to reflect on.
That Geshe Thubten Chönam Tamji Siddha Janganzu Kowala Kiegi Rimba Ma Gyudan Jebudu Si Rimba Kowa Senanganzu Leda Nyomo Ungu Chudi Kowa Tishi Diki Rimba Gyuntiki Rimba Chikche Now Kowala Taryodu that Kowala Bangbi Rimba Je Tarba Tamji Kimbe Tobi Badu Rimba Gyuntiki Rimba Chikche Jezadi Kordigu Chönam Dinetixche and Dinidu Sene Chimju Chedu and the Garcet Nibadi Gyundian Namia Lua Meton Shingeso. Gyundian Namia Lua Meton Shingeso. Tu Chechevachi, Korea Kadesina, Gyudan Jen Jelatin and Druba Yimba Mato, Gyudan Jen La Mateba Saugin Mindu Sembegi, then Gyndi Lua Mevares, Gyudi Sasavicella, Devudi Yunguyobade, Devudi Yesavicella, Di Gyudi Injimiji, Gychilla Duyobade, Hakugores. Tis not dinashin Tangazuki, Koalen Debi, Tarbata Tamji Kimbu, Topsia, Deangpa, Jimbi, Gyudan Gin Chilet in the Yunguba, Gyudan Gin Lam Yamlinje, Lo Gombalet in the Yunguba, then do sin Rimbajine, then he gets some done, Gombalet in the Yunguba, did that touch to touch. Touch Hebares, just a Lua Unimidus, just not Janju Sem Com, Pajugi Yamlin Cheban, Sanje Kopam, the and it told Jamniji combine the Dikela, Janju Sem Yungu, but the Janju Sem Gidi, Gu Injimiji, Jamniji, Deva Mother, Jamniji, Matua Mindu said. Corby Chu, Tujiki Chukaneshina, Yudan Kiela Deva Mother, Yudan Kiela Matua Saugin, Mindu Sembegida, Toy Hagoya Chiche. The name Koala debut church in Chasa, Shangela, Dun, Shana Matua Saugin, Mindu said, How go do you rename Lua Metonshes? Chesa Denegate Tony, and then take some time to do Shen Jebachi, and Guntenam Lua Saugin, Mission, Matua Saugin, Mindu, Sambaji, Ligi, somebody. Then it's him ever never chili. Semeng evan yes na seme dogors, seme dogres go, semang evan igles, do Jebachi, good again, shall Debas Mato, shall Madu Bigi Korea said the Zawaki Mindu. Now call a debut treating good and shall do troop the Mato, shall Madu was Zawaki Mindu, Sembi, Semeng evan never nigri, seme dogres or then the dogres.
Here then, there are two streams of phenomena to investigate and come to gain certainty of. The one is the accumulation of causes that lead to our perpetuation of samsaric existence. The second is the causes that lead to the eradication of samsara and the attainment of nirvana. Both the perpetuation of suffering, our suffering existence in samsara, as well as the progression towards an attainment of nirvana, come about independent on causes. Every result comes about independent on causes. Every result comes about independent on causes. Causes accumulated lead to a result. This we need to be very clear on. For example, our aspiration to attain liberation from suffering is a cause. the final attainment of liberation from suffering is the result, and between these two, so many other causes, innumerable other causes need to be cultivated. Mental paths in particular need to be cultivated. Those mental paths are results of a number of causes, and those mental paths become causes for the further progression and the eventual attainment of liberation. Similarly, if we aspire to become bodhisattvas and want to generate bodhicitta, this aspiration is a cause. Merely leaving it as an aspiration, though, is an insufficient cause to lead to the attainment of bodhicitta. Further causes are required, such as love, compassion, and the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. Recognizing this, one can have confidence that through training in first giving rise to the aspiration, thereafter cultivating love and so forth, bodhicitta will come. Bodhicitta will come. In this way, we come through this reflection, as we see here in the second line, you see that causes and their results never deceive or are infallible. Here, through this reflection, one comes to see that all phenomena of samsara and nirvana are dependent on causes. Every result comes from causes. Causes lead to a result. And we now need to reflect on this to the extent that we gain certainty with a valid cognizer. We come to realize this and gain the strength of conviction that is through accumulating causes, we'll gain our desired result. It's through not accumulating another stream of causes that we will thereby not gain an undesired result.
Kori che down kole debi che kane chimbai na shen gyudan jen shen chile tune tuwa de matyo ba zao yin mindu sempe ke semta deni ke cheme ngeba nyen yodu ane garji ke sene mikbi teso ganyin kunshi baas jizu mikbi teso da du denzin si ora deji tenpa tuba zibe denzin di karsana kāngla ya mā tuyabā yu di pā tsū lō nāng yu tu kāngla mā tā rāng mūni tūpa nāng kōrā kāngla ya mā tu rāng mūni tūpa nāng wā nā shī yō rē sam dzimbi ki mīkpa di kāngla ya mā rāng mūni tūpa di rwa tā mīkpa chā rā kōrā di dzing kōrā wā jizā mīkpa dēndzing ki kāngla ya mā rāng mūni tūpa nā shī pā yō rē sam dzimba nā shī rāng mūni tūpa nāng wā di jizā dēndzing rwa chō kāngla ya mā tu rāng mūni tūpa tsa wā di mīndu kāngla tuyane dhruva chi resha sanpeke samtangyo tu leyo tu ka kānglaye mātyupa rāngmūni dhruva tsawa tu mindu sachi hāko yungu resha jizan di hāko ya tu mikbi jeso kāngyo kun shiba se meba chāsonga resha wara kānglaye rāngmūni dhruva tong rāngmūni dhruva di meba chāche tonggo ma resha jizan di yule meba chāche dende tongsang chi le yungu resha tongsang hāko resha deshi kun shiba la nga zoke chala lan di yune meba chāche shiba la kiro wa 대지 덴진 데라 칼라이마 랑문이 두바 난고르와 제가 덴디게 삼다도 제 뛰는 두바 시레샤 선배게 삼도 내가 체명해 봐니디 다 칼라야 마도 랑문이 두바디 민두 삼 통여디 니 동바이 도 롱을라 칼라야 마도 랑문이 두바디 메바샤송 동상샤르고 제가 군시 봐 제가 대체 데니게 미도에 가 민두 선배 데네 동상하지 체명해 봐니디 내 동바이 또 봐래서 그래 mikpe teso kanyo kunshik pasa di dene shi ngeba nye du tenjige samtang tenjige tuandu shi samtang da kanglai mato rangon du zawa kiri mindu sempe tongsa chik tongyo du an toba desi na da tongba yi toba resi.
Here we see that the need to reflect on all the phenomena of samsara and nirvana, reflecting how they are dependent arisings, dependent on causes. Both the group of phenomena within samsara as well as that within nirvana, those results come about in dependence on causes. And so all results, both those that we have attained and those that we aspire to, come about in dependence on causes. And those results too become causes for further results. Reflecting like this, we gain great certainty. We ascertain this truth with a valid cognizer. That's the second line. Then the third line, you completely eradicate whichever object is focused on. So whichever object of samsara and nirvana one is one's object of meditation. We first, as we heard yesterday, see how it appears to our mind. And it appears as if it is truly existent. It appears as if it is independent, not influenced by anything at all, self-existent, existing by way of its own nature or essence, and therefore independent, not dependent on anything at all. But when we investigate in the way just presented, we come to realize it is dependent. It appears as independent, but it is dependent, dependent on causes. This way, we realize it's empty of existing in the way that it appears. It's empty of true existence. And that way, we realize emptiness. And when the phenomenon that appears to us as being truly existent is in this way eradicated, because now the truly existent phenomenon does not appear, only emptiness appears. In this way then, one completely eradicates whichever object is focused on, because the truly existent object is eradicated, and now only emptiness appears. In this way, we come to realize that all phenomena of samsara and nirvana are empty of true existence.
Deni sanje kibi lamla shu sede. Deni sede deshi tongmat mi to beshed sigore. Deshi deni sede deshi ngazu chebaji tenje samta dene kangla yema tuba temba tuba zime desele nawa na shi rangwani tuba tawa ki bindu sembege deni ge to pe chema kiyedu deni chema di 동이 두고래 데네 체마들라 갈아서 데니 상계기별 람 시제 담라 쇼시데디 데네게 동이 두로디 다 장주 셈기 군에 라제 데네게 냠는 제도 데라와디다 상계고바 토바지비 람데레스 장주 셈기 군에 람 군론세디로 군론 죄시도 장주 셈기 군에 람 군론 셈제 탐지 상계고바 토비 치르 삼다지 된 동바니고 데네게 로디 고명도 로디 다 상계 기별 람레스 제가 상계 델레 상계 고본 토비 탑람 람 님보 람디레스디 제가 데리고 람디 상계 기별 람레스 월다.
In the third line, one comes to realize emptiness. The valid cognizer, one cultivates the wisdom realizing emptiness. And at that time, now the fourth line, and at that time refers to when one is realizing emptiness with a valid cognizer, then one enters into a path, one engages in a path, one has now generated a mental path that delights the Buddhas. In particular, when this is done with the motivation of bodhicitta.
장주 심규 군내라지 데네 동면 두베 셔랍 등하스 귤에 깨와이나 데네 상기베 람라 슈바레서 람라 슈크세 등하즈네 모다나라 주르데 모다라 슈네 조우드세 모다 슈바스 마 되발라 슈츠가 슈레 그루와 제사 슈레데 람라 슈발레데 람데 귤에 깨바데 시고라 제사 데네게 장주 심규 군내라 데네 동면 두베 셔랍 데네게 마한스 귤에 깨와이나 데네 상기베 람라 슈요레스 람라 슈바레스.
The reason why the Buddhas are delighted when when a bodhisattva attains such a realization is because it's when the bodhisattva gains the realization of emptiness and enters into that path of now having realized emptiness as a bodhisattva, that it can be said that they certainly are on the path towards enlightenment, because they've cultivated the three principal aspects. They now, with the realizations of bodhicitta and emptiness, are certainly on the path to the attainment of enlightenment. Hence the Buddhas are delighted. It's just like when we actually depart on a journey. We are now have left home, we're in our car, and we're traveling. we are heading towards our final destination. We are no longer planning and preparing, just aspiring to go and preparing. We are now going. And because the Bodhisattva now has realized emptiness, the causes are accumulated for the eventual attainment of Buddhahood.
Nanglo mazu bardo namtru nalo shuyo marwa nga shuyo de mar shuba shesu shuna shuba se shesa majina de ba le gro jesa namtru pa namnal pa rode namtru na shuyo mar ta nga zu pa ne namdana le cha de su cha sa da che wala che cha che namtru na le de sa na namtru de pa ko kya byo de da nga namtru de shu sa bare da ga ji le yo sang do trosa de la gyobule ya ro da ko troya ko zu gyobuli gro andi na shin Bendigo Geshe Thubten Rabten Bendigo to be shared the rang le kune kebaina tala sangi kebe lamla sangi ko to lamla ya shubare jezada dene yane kwani ko to yane ko to pene na sangi ko pa to ya le ya ko to tu gre se wor da dandala.
Just like when we've given rise to an aspiration to travel to another country, we have to accumulate a number of causes to be able to do so. And eventually we come to the point where we are sitting in the aeroplane. And when we're sitting in the aeroplane and it's taken off, and due to the power of the causes that we have accumulated, we can have great confidence that we will arrive at our destination, and we'll do so quickly. Similarly, when the causes are accumulated that will lead to Buddhahood, at this point, certainty is attained that that will be achieved.
Dadya Sangi Yebi Lam said, Sangi Tunigo Retro, the Nigel Lam, the Anzu Yamlen General's Kula Keva, and the Nigel Lam, the Yamlen Chicken de la Sangi to Nigo Resta, Carson Anzu Beneruada, Pamadigi, Soso Pulpa, Tewa Shu, Yorwadane. There was a Pamig Lobden Chelia, and she Lobjon Chel, Lobden Cheven, and then Budi Lobjon Majevana Pamalia, just Seba Mashimahava. That Pamadigi Lobden Jeba and Budi Lobjon Cheven, Pamalia Mixigi, the Kaoshu Junguru down there, Kaoshu, and Dinashi, Sanji, Carson Pamagi, Corn Pugul, Zewa Yubache. Pud Momba Koran Digi, Yawash Missy Yawash Yegi, Pamagi Doyorva, Chesang Pul Momba, the Ganga Mategi, Koran and Missy Yawoyag Danda. The was a call of John Jay, and Budi did love your Cheven, Pamaka Chagoro. And Dinaji, Sangi Garson, I to call a treasure, and call a trova mate, Shalaya Pando Yachim Duptugi, Sanjoko Pontoyagi. Tablamchi ma tempa enza nga zu ge dandala du chin songba enza jembe ze ong ge songba enza da nga zu di nyamsu lemba ine de sang yu tu ki go re sen odati no pe ya go re da sam tu ki go re je za de ne enza sang ye ge be lam se de da di chane da ne janshi sim yu ku ne la tong yu de be she de la sang ye ge be lam se.
Just like parents delight in every success of their child, so too do the Buddhas delight in the success of sentient beings. A parent generates a great joy arises within the continuum of a parent and every success of the child. And why? Not just because of their temporary happiness, but they're gaining ever more confidence that the child is growing up well and that their future will be wonderful. Similarly, as we spiritually develop, especially when a point like this arises, that as a bodhisattva we gain a realization of emptiness, the value of cognition, the Buddhas delight in the progress of their children, in that they have certainty in our eventual attainment of enlightenment.
That in the Dang Zo, the Dang sometime the Geshe Zo the Dinjin Tawachu, some Danaji Chagoro, just a Dinjig, some Dadadi, those in a Dinjig, Dinjin Tawachu, some Dadu, Kala, Chikdun and Juba, the Resha, Sembe Semda Chobaledi, Kala Maduba, Rangu in the Jubadi, Mindu, Sembe, some long, some down to Gorova, the Neza, Dinjig, some Danadi, Bemasi Kichimbo, Tangazo. 동이 또베 탑람데 다 가산이 디송으로 와다 안 디랭야 데디델이야 콜리기 최탐제 안 덴디게 두신 삼다데 아니 루아메 바다 하고 용 그래 사 디랭야 디송도 와
Reflecting here then, recalling what we looked at yesterday afternoon in terms of how to meditate on dependent arising, and here seeing how we should apply it to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana, recognizing that despite every phenomenon appearing to us as being independent, nothing exists in this way. Everything we think about, every object of thought, every thought that arises to us, despite appearing as independent, is dependent, mostly dependent on causes, always dependent on imputation by mind. We reflect like this to gain great certainty that causes lead to results and results come from causes. So this then is the meaning that we've been looking at in this verse.
자당한저 디린다 가상한저 덴지 제와 숨다에 한저 당보 나 세번 나이 된도 안에 제바체 안에 나라시 마두바 또바나 또발라 동이 또야라 내레라 요레스 니 제레야 안에 나한저 풍부에 된도 또야다 하세야지 가상한저 기시디시로 자당한저 가상 갈스네 가나 세베다 세야디 나저 나기 된도 동 덴지 삼다다디시 대한저 풍부에 된도 덴지 삼다다시로와 아디링 아주 변에 셈 사지다 다 저어 셈이 디나네 장아주 제바치서 또 셈이 된도 제바치야디 다 계체로 차고래 셈이 된도
In the previous session yesterday afternoon, I went through how to meditate on the self to see that it is not inherently existent despite appearing as such. And we should start on the self because it's easier to recognize. Thereafter, we progress to the physical and mental aggregates. Now, the third key area to look at is that of the mind.
두 제바지는 가서 수부디게 나래샤 선배 제바 뭐소야 가시게 되네 뭐송고래 가시에 셈자바이나 수부디게 나 말에 다 되네 수부디 나 레메도 두 심지도 나세데 다 되네게 셈 나네 셈 켜버와시도 될 군신 남시 세지 셈 켜버시도 센 되네게 셈 셈질은 뭐송고래 지나다도 제바지도 너데 바다 라기 바로시나 다 나세데 파 심주지 제바제제도 갑라 타르투나 이기 넘버 쉐바데 나레샤스 가사세디 이기 넘버 쉐바레샤스는 두치네 수부디게 가사 레멘도 지사다 조 타르투네 이기 넘버 쉐바시 나레샤스는 단 매니 제라마와나 데수기 나세 제바치디고 나도 수부디 땅 나세데 가서 수부디레샤스 술파 뭐송고래 매니 삼잠백에다 수딩아 말해 다지 지금 말이 될 견만 보인 거래. 시다도 어찌 짐주치에 봐라. 다디나데 이기셰베 나네자. 다 군신 남셰시 용거래. 다디가 강사세도 군신 남셰야들이 에세 되는 거였은 거래. 다 제라 너데 봐다 우마 랑유비기 이기 남바셰바 참모들 이기 남바셰바 상마 말해서 이기 남바셰바 참모지요. 참모슈 참모지요. 디다 강사세데 디레에서 무슨 거래. 세상 뭐였으나 두치네 좀다 소수기 제바진 거였으나 난 엄마 텐규비 가서나 나세디 데니기 제바제네 니야요 말은 제바제나 나디레세데 니야요 말했어 제사다 풍봉하고 간호질 발뢰 봤다 봤으면 말했어 마도 그 두스 제바제네 니야지요 말했어 제사파 타르투네 이기 넘버 쉐비게 이기 넘버 쉐바데 이기 넘버 쉐비 균리야 나세제 뢰 봤다 봤으면 요래서 이기 넘버 쉐바 야는 이기 넘버 쉐바 참모데 야는 이기 넘버 쉐비 참이 균들 봐 나서 발로 따바즈도 요래 마도 데네 따바자 많이 받제바치는 이해요 말해서 어두스는 나무 송달에 미라마다 리고 따고 제바체다는 관계
Amongst Buddhist philosophers there is quite some discussion, quite some debate over what is the self, where the self is to be found or how it is to be expressed. So amongst the varying philosophical schools, some in the Vaibhashika assert that actually the body is the person. Others, they state that it is subtle consciousness. There is difference between them in terms of how they present what that subtle consciousness is, where the self abides, or that is the illustration of the self. For example, the Chittamatrans state a specific, stable consciousness called the foundational consciousness, or usually translated as the mind basis of all. This foundational consciousness is stable and unchanging, and therefore the Chittamatrans say that is the self. Whereas the Svatantika, they will say, no, there's no such thing as a foundational consciousness, but the self rather is a mental consciousness. But we acknowledge that we have many mental consciousnesses, and the one that is the illustration of the self is a very subtle mental consciousness. So here we see that there are different assertions as to the illustration of the self. The Prasangika then, they hold that if you look in any of these assertions, whether the body or the subtle consciousness, you cannot find a self. And the Prasangika don't refute that such a thing as the foundational consciousness exists. So then what do the Prasangika, the highest philosophical school, asserts as the illustration of the self? They say that the self is a mere imputation by mind, and onto what? The continuum of consciousness. The continuum of consciousness. Onto that, the self is merely or only asserted. That's all. It's just an assertion, and onto what? Or it's just an imputation, and onto what? The continuum of consciousness.
Number sheba said, sim say sheba said, that he me toya merwa, mewanza, danga to Kanachile, Legora Seba, Sheba said, the Kanachile said the Ajik Shimju, that sheba di sim coronia and jeba cheche, sim coron were the sim coron that then and the sim gitendo, Dembamadu, Tombani Comode, the sim coron were sim coron that lorpa, Chick, Danish Nangudu, now and Ashinji, do Mindu Jeba Chedu, and they are and sim coron as Lola, now and Rangwani to be Tomba said, Doyo, and sim gitendo Rashima, Tombani Toba, the Sungorwa.
The same process that we went through yesterday. Now, when the object is the mind, or is the mind, the first step is to recognize how it appears to consciousness. Here, based on our prior meditations, we'll readily recognize that it appears as if it is independent. It exists by way of its own nature, and therefore not dependent on anything at all. And we investigate, and we come to see it does not exist in the way that it appears. It's empty of true existence. In this way, one realizes the emptiness of consciousness.
Sim said, Dembar to Mindu Cheva Chevala, Tambokora, Sim Coron, Gadichi Legures, and Wilson Chagorwa. Tis not that Sim Coron, Sim said, Gadichi Wilson Goresene, Yuji number share Chinang, Di Yudi number Chen Educan. Number the Gene, Hago, Hago, Ripa, you Ripa. Then Chilia, Sheba says, Sheba Lana, Sim, Sheba Lago, Sheba said, Denishing Wilson Gores, Ripa said, Denishing Wilson Gores.
The first step of the meditation is to recognize the mind. So what is consciousness? So consciousness has two aspects. One, an object. Each consciousness has necessarily an object, and that object appears to it. Often it's said that it appears clearly to it. The second aspect is that that object is known by that consciousness. So these are the two aspects of mind. The object that the object appears to it and is known by it.
Na dini ngazo sam nala dini gi sheba de ya ji chara da chamo da ra ba de mong hu yong re ji za dini za ngazo ge da de bi ji da mang che sheba ra ba de bi ji den go re bin ngazo mang che ne ga de bi ji den go so ne wang xie wang bi gi bin mi gi wang xie ji mi gi wang bo le de ne an de su zha ma ra tong an de le de ne an de sheba chi ge di su sheba ra ba che go re di na xin zha am chu lo go de na yu wang bo le de ne zha de Dela tene sheba shikigore. Tina je reakcha ro. Chisa wangponga la tene nga zugi sugi rinpo. Dela mibiki sheba rakwa chi mangpo kigore. Chisa nga zu manga chi sheba rakwa de beshu tamade. Sheba chamo digi. Da sheba ya pene du shimshi de rakwa de ma sheba pe shivu sheba shib chamo chungore. Di nga zugi da de beshu tam tugo mare.
Generally, when we look inward and become aware of consciousness, the consciousnesses that we become aware of are those that we utilize the most. Firstly, sense consciousnesses. The 5 sense consciousness of sight, sound, and so forth. And these are immediately followed by a variety of mental consciousnesses. For example, we see something. All that appears to the eye sense consciousness is the color and shape. And then it's a variety of mental consciousnesses that interpret and relate to that object that has appeared to the sense consciousness. Similarly with sound, all that appears to the ear sense consciousness is mere sound. Then immediately follows a number of mental consciousnesses, labeling the source of the sound, what's being said, and so forth, and putting meaning to it. So it's the same process for our other sense consciousnesses, which are followed by mental consciousnesses. So these are all very coarse, very coarse consciousnesses. And whilst if we investigate them, they all appear as truly existent, and we investigate, we come to find they are empty of true existence in the same way as we heard before. What we are talking about in this meditation is a far subtler consciousness. And this very subtle consciousness, we actually can't make use of. We do not utilize.
Sheba said the Dido, Danga the some does the Tianjin Jawa, some Dangora, Tianjin, some Dangora. Some Dadu, the Sheba said the Kanashi said on two chene, they Yuchi, Nangshi, the Negu Yudi Rigbigi, Riktukan de Sheba Sigurua, Digares and Daba Shimju Chedu, Danganzulen, Lola Nandu, Korong, the Nig Sheba Chik, Gala Amado Korong, Chiksudu, Yoba Rojik, Nanzuki, Lola, Nangore. Just that I do Shimjuchi Tianjin Jawa, so some dadu, the Niki Sheba dida, and Gijing Achi Chedu, Gijing Amadi Reve Chimadire. Just that Gijing Amadi, Giji Chimadi, Gijing Amadi le Dune Chuamato, Gijing Amad Lamatuan Mena, Giji Chimadi, Sheba Chimadi Yoyomare. Just that Gijing Amala Dugore. Just that the Giji Chimadi Mena, Gijing Amase Yoyomare. Just that Amadi Chimadi le Dugore. Just that Kuni, Kijik, Sheba Kijik, Delia Kijimang, Shed, Chasada, Kijingamanga, Kichimadi, Kijingamanga, Dune de Mado, Dune Juba Mado, the Yundiki did, Dune Jutigore, the Matoba, Duya meeting and Chiche. That Kijingamadi, Kichimachima, Dune, Ngama Shagoma, the good Yunde Chegomadina, Duruki, dinner Tapet, said Chagora, Kijingamadi. Chimala Dune and Shagor Mado, Chimala Madoba, Namase Shamearo. Just do Chidi, Kijing Amada, Chimase, Sheba said, Koron Kijing Achingachi Yobache, the young Kijing Amada, Chimalpa, Chichile, Dudevas, Mado Madoba, in a meeting. Chizan Kijing Ama, the Chima de Lutoba, the Junde Mara, Jevu Marawa, Chizanko Dene Tabarwa. 제가 기징아마래도 기지 치마들래 때네 나마 스타바로와 규디레데 제부 말와 규제불에 때네 말다데 디 때네 따바 규고란 제불에 때세디 때네 따바라 차고래 마도 제부디 규딜에 때네 깨와래스네 때네 중화세 디 규지기 때네 차고래 부데 아말에 깨와르와 부데 아메 제부르와 제산 부 아말에 때네 깨와디 규지기 때네 아마디 부글이 때네 깨마르와 부마지가 아메 깨사르와 제산 아마디 부글이 되고르와 되바디 때네 따바르와 때네 아마스 따바 부글이 때네 아마스 따바르마도 아마디 부글이 깨네 깨와 마르와 제산 때네 따바레서 아마디 부글이 띵고르와 때네 아마스 따바르와 디따바디 균제 레벨라는 균제 말에 때네 따바레서 지지상 아마세디 부구지면 아마라 차요 말와 아마세 르파 따고로 코 아마레스 팔로 따고로와 따바디 술리티네 따고르스 부구레 때네 콜라 아마스 따바로와 제사 아마디 부구디게 제보 레벨라네 제보 마로와 제사디 아마세디 부구레 때네 아마스 따바디 때네 따바스 때네 따바 텐제세 때네 따바르마도 제보디 마레서 다 부구디 아말레 때네 깨와레 라비오디 다 아말레 때네 깨와레스 깨와지도 고 부구디 아말레 때네 깨와시 아마디 규디 부구디 제보 차고디 균디기 텐데 차고래 제데 이제 부구디 아말레 깨와레 라비오와 아말레 때네 깨와레 라비오 디 때네 깨와레스도 균디기 텐데 차고래 제 나디 깨와시 깨시도 균디기 텐데 차고래 아마세디 밍따야디 부구 제부 임비 김세 시고 말 그래서 부고래 때네 아니 아마스 파다 바로 부고래 때네 파다 바자 그 균제마 유마래 가서 제부 말에 저 때네 따 바자지 제가 셰바세디 셰바 기지 치마치마디 인가말에 때네 깨와와 제가 셰바 치마치마 기지 치마치마디 기지 인가말에 떼바디 균제기 텐데서 디나신 기지 인가마디 기지 치마를 때네 샤고르마도 균제 제고 말와 제가 기지 치마를 떼내 샤바래 떼내 답에 떼내서 차고래지 기지 가마디 치마를 떼내 가마 랍도 치마를 떼내 가마 샤마도 치마를 마 떼봐 가마 샤요 말와 가마 라도 치마 될 떼내 샤고르마도 떼내 샤고르 마도 가마디 치마디 제보를 별라네 말와 치마디 마제가래 가마디 줍사로와 기자 디기지 가마디 치 치마지 디 될 떼내 깨와 제보 떼내 답에 떼내지 균지기 떼내지 디 가마세데 가마라도 델라 때네 가마 샤워로 마도 이네 델라 때네 끼요 말로 디시고로 때네 답에 텐데레서
Every consciousness has an object. Anything we think of, being a thought, has an object. We're thinking of something. So every object of thought appears to consciousness. It's the one characteristic of consciousness. And secondly, it is known by that consciousness. It's known, it's cognized. Just to say as an aside, it's not labeled by that consciousness. That is separate. In English, these words can sound quite similar. It's known, but it's not labeled. Okay, so that's an aside, but it'll come up now. So every object of thought, whether it's an object of form, for example, something we see or hear, or another consciousness, if we're thinking of a consciousness, that every object appears to us, appears to consciousness, is known by the consciousness. And how does it appear? It appears as if it exists by way of its own essence. It appears as if it is independent. It appears real to us. It appears as if it's not dependent on parts or imputation or causes. Every object. Then when we investigate, we come to see that that is not the case. So how so then with consciousness? So the consciousness, if we look at any consciousness of your choice, there's an object that appears to us, and it knows its object. Thereafter, that consciousness has a second moment, a third moment, fourth moment. All these moments, one after the other. There is a relationship between these moments of consciousness. So whilst consciousness itself doesn't appear to us as if it is momentary, there is this dependency on these parts of consciousness, these moments, that independence on the prior moment, the latter will come. Independence on the prior moment, the latter has come. There is this relationship of dependency. But not only is this relationship of dependency between the moments of consciousness, where the prior moment leads to the results in the latter moment, and the latter moment came from the prior moment. That relationship of dependency, of causality, with that, there is no, maybe we can say, labeling of prior moments or latter moments. The relationship of dependency there is of cause and effect. The prior leads to the latter. But there is no labeling of prior and latter. That is done, that is a different form of dependency. Only, we can call it mutually dependency or dependence on imputation. That independence on labeling, can we say this is prior, that is latter? And the other way so that's dependency on labeling. The other way to express it, mutually dependent. Only in dependence on there being a latter can there be a former. So in this way, we can investigate consciousness in three different ways to see that it is dependent. To go back to an illustration that we're much more familiar with, I use it more often, is that of a child born from a mother. So there it's very clear, there's a relationship of causality. But there's also here a relation, as a dependence on causes. There's also a relationship that is mutually dependent. Only because a woman has given birth to a child can she be called a label. Can she be called a mother? And to be called a mother, consciousness needs to label mother. So there is a dependency on imputation, mother. There's also a mutual dependency that because a woman has given birth to a child, she can be called a mother. And similarly with a child, all children are born from mothers, but it's because they're born from a mother that they can be called children. And moreover, them being called children or child is dependent on imputation by mind. So here we see three different ways that one can investigate the dependency, that a phenomena is a dependence arising. Dependence on causes, a mutual dependency, and dependence on imputation by mind. Or to express the dependence on imputation can be called dependence on designation or dependence on labeling.
안두스네 셰발 파 심지도 지나 셰바 세데 기징 아마다 치말 파 지되되 바마도 기징 아체라 마되베게 셰바직 고르메 두스네 직도 심지시도 셰바 가네시나 고 개방 야나 기징 아마도 되바 야나 거지 치말 되바 기징 아체라 되되 바마도 기시마 싱아체라 마되바데 두스네 민두 선배게 셰바지 삼다 직제 나데네 셰바 세디 하지 유지를 되고 거래 그런 유지 낭네 들 그 셰바가 릭발에 거라 릭발도 지하고 거라 하고에 유지 고거라 진짜 유거를 유를 직접 봐마도 유매나 다 셰바매 그런식 낭제 뒤오기 되고 릭발 고거 진짜 데 유를 되어봐래서 진짜 셰바세디 기징아치를 되어봐 유지를 되어봐마도 되네게 유를 맞되어봐 기징마시 같이 맞되어봐되라 매로 진짜 셰바세디다 기징아치를 되어봐 랑이 율을 때봐 타쳐봐 대신 예를 셰바나지 루아메바 통세 시에서 어디 대신 예라도 균지 루아메바 코르디게 주 균지 루아메바 통세 타쳐봐 로시 디나시 당아서 셰바티야 기징아치를 떼봐 다 안에 그런 유지를 떼봐 마도 되네기 맞대봐 되기 매대지 통여도 안 되네 통여도 갑라 갈라 그랬습니다 되네 통여도 네 셰바세디 강라이 맞대봐 랑문에 두바세디 강라에 마도바 랑원이 주표 자오기는 민도스 제산 셰바 세데 강라 기징아 칠레 떼바 랑기 유레 떼바 델야 뢰파 다바라 셰딜야 셰바 신민 뢰파 다바라 떼바마도 데네라 마떼바다 랑원이 주표에 셰바 자오기는 민도 심 통여도 나 셰바 랑신이 마주바 셰비된도 동반이 도고 그래지래 셰바디 강라에 마도바 랑원이 주바디 라고 니교 말와 제사다 제사 셰바디 가선 규다 셰바세데 기징아치르 떼바 호라 율르 떼바 데니기 유직바데라 뢰파 디 셰바레서 뢰따파 데니기 젤 따네 떼디요 셰바마도 데니기 마도바디 민두 제바지디 땡디게 남샤 뒤통소로와 뒤통요도 당아주 로르 나와나 셰바세데 강라에 마도바 코롱원이 주바 나와나 자와기니 민두 섬데 통요도 디자인 셰바 템바마 주바 도바레지 셰베팅도 동이 도바레지
Consciousness is always dependent on a sequence of moments. Current moment of consciousness is dependent the preceding moment of consciousness, which itself was dependent on a moment previous to that, and so forth. So too, does each previous moment get followed by another moment of consciousness. Therefore, there's a mutual dependency. Consciousness is mutually dependent. It cannot be independent. Secondly, consciousness is also dependent on having an object. We heard the definition of consciousness is that the object that consciousness is clear knowing. What is the clear knowing of? An object. Therefore, consciousness necessarily has an object. It is dependent on the object that appears to it clearly and is known by it. So this is a second area of dependency. Consciousness is dependent on having an object that appears to it and is known. Moreover, now thirdly, consciousness is also dependent on being labeled as such by another consciousness. One can only refer to whichever consciousness one is meditating on by labeling it as consciousness by another consciousness. So in this way, consciousness is also dependent on imputation by mind, or dependent on labeling or designation by mind. Reflecting like this, we now go back to the second line. You see their causes and their results never deceive. Or to use, instead of never deceive, we can say are infallible. So here we see the infallibility of dependent arising. In this way, we come to recognize that whether it's the most subtle consciousness we're reflecting on or any other consciousness, despite, like all objects, appearing to us as being independent, when we investigate, we can recognize it is dependent, and therefore it is empty of existing the way that it appears, empty of true existence.
And those in a language, the niggy semgi canlia, those in a semgi words from Digala Jabba, those in the Ajig Gazam Gilia, Delia, and the Jiggy, Sem Raparabati Mash in the Sem Chamo Canlia, Jabba, Sem Chamo Korongi, Sem Korongi, Sem Rangi, Sem Korongi, Sem Korongi Tendu, don't buy Jabba Ligo, that's the Ma Char Jabba Leo. Sem sosorana sem korongi jeba chigen sem korongi jeba jese shidi suden to sem korongi den to jeba chigore jesan dus jechene sem korongi den to jeba chine sem korong rashin yutube donsa re doyodu da di dongyi to bolo di dongyi da bolo da chamo sem na de chasho dige sem na ga sem chamo na de sem chasho chigore sem chasho korongi jeba chi korongi korong rashin ma do dongba to bolo di da dongyi to bolo chasho chegore.
So here one starts to reflect on coarser levels of consciousness that are easier for us to recognize, see how they appear, investigate in the way just presented, and we'll see they do not exist in the way that they appear at all. They are empty of true existence. And we progress down to subtler levels of consciousness, eventually coming to the subtlest level of consciousness, and we see that this too does not exist truly. It is empty of true existence. So in this way, we have a mind or consciousness investigates itself through varying degrees of subtlety, and we come to recognize that consciousness, like all objects of form too, all objects are empty of true existence.
지상은저 상지 유고헌 토발라 지상다 동이도 불로디 셈 차쇼 디게 셈 차쇼 셈 나가도 셈 나데 셈 차쇼 디게 코롱기 된도 동이 또 불로지 동이 또 두고서 고거래 상지 고바도 발라 셈 차쇼 코롱기 라싱이 마도 또 두고거래 디마도 바나 다 상지 고바도 두고 마 상지 고바도 발라 데니기 셈 차쇼 코롱기 라싱이 마도 바 라니 소스라는 소스라나 라싱이 마도 또 고거래 또 That is a semi to Tonio Comcure, said the Java semi to Comcure, said the Jumsendida.
When we have developed spiritually and we are skilled meditators, we will be able to actually investigate the subtlest level of consciousness, and we will do so with that same consciousness. The subtlest level of consciousness investigates itself. So at the moment, that's not how we can meditate on consciousness. We use one coarser mind to investigate another coarser mind. Eventually, we'll become so skilled that we'll be able to investigate the subtlest level of consciousness with that same consciousness and realize it does not exist truly. And that is required. That level of analysis is required in order to attain Buddhahood.
And the Jinye Langanzo Gasagi Tendo Jebaches, Napumbu Tendo Dente some Tomba Jebaches, and some Dana She Dukabla, Gasa Sede Kagarwa, Sheba Koromarwa, Chesan Pini Gasa Disha, D Tendo that temper, De Gasa the temper to Marup Sede, Jebache, Semchi Pa, called that Chigura, Chesan Jebache Shida. Gasa tempo to Modo Jeba Chidukabla, Jeba chicken, this Simshawa, Sim Logi Chigurua. The Yu Shanda Chigla, Gasa Chilapa, Shanta Chil, Jeba Chigurua. Is that not to be the Josel study Joseph Dasa Shidang, and to Simye Kaharwa. Dinashing unto Gasa tempo to Modo Jeba Chidukabla, Sim Digi, Jeba chicken, Lodigi, Sim Kora tempo to Modo Jeba Chigo Marwa, Pasho Gasa did Ganesh do the Jeba Chigurua. The Lord did what Jebacho. Dinashing unto Pumbo temper to Mother Jebashi, the Pumbo said the Suki Pumbo City, the same gi, Pumbo the Parmish, Pumbo did that now, and I do me to say Jebachi mother, same Koron temper to Mother Jebachigo Mara. Tisan di Jebachetan, Dongbani Jebachino, Lodi, Rapachagore. Tangazu Dima, the Sheshe Marshid, same treasure, dinner, same none, same treasure, Korongi Tendu. Koron temper to Mother Jebachede, Rani temper to Mother Jebachet, did not to be told that same treasure, Tomba to be same treasure Chagore.
So the level of practitioner that we are now, when we investigate the self, we investigate the self with a consciousness. So there is a separation, an other between the two, just like consciousness and this table are separate. So whether we're investigating, seeking the self, we have consciousness investigating how the self appears and so forth. Likewise, when investigating the aggregates, how do the aggregates appear to consciousness? And then we have another consciousness investigating to see if they exist in that way. Likewise, when we currently investigate our varying consciousnesses, we have one consciousness investigating another. Eventually, though, we'll become developed enough that we'll be able to investigate not only the subtlest mind, but with the subtlest mind itself, and realize that it's empty of inherent existence. And that is essential, that is indispensable to attain Buddhahood.
Alright, 당은 대신 난이 간제래 가지고 드린 저게 되게 가르스는 돈이 또 비게 체로시 괜히 또 고래라도 당은 지파 코리 최나다 코발에 대비 최간에 지내 곧야 제바치 윤제 땡진 저좀 섬도 제바치 두 제바치 갑라 안에 간삼치리야 땡진 저와 중화지 지레샤 마다 땡진 마저 땡지를 현실에 마디오바 싸우기 민두 선배기 되니게 루아메 바데 되니게 참아지 땡진 저와 주 땡지 도베 참아지 기기 돼서 되니게 어디까블라 안 되네시도 세티네 강래 마디오바다 강래 마디오 랑고에 주바 싸우기 민두 나세나데 풍보나 가데스나 강래 마디오바 그랑고에 주도 싸우기 민두 선배기 녀바녀바 지리게 돼서 이 녀바녀베 기니에 소나다 델리아나 동바이 도바레스 다디 데니기 동바이 도벨로디 다 전주 셈기 심비코네 심비 냠는 지도 될라 딩이 동바도 별로텔라 상기 기베 람세데 당은 상기 고바 토바지베 탑람 녀봉원에 데 람디레스 제사디 겨기베 람레스 제사디 한주게다 전주 셈기 심비코네 딩이 동이도 별로디 한주길에 깨요나 다 겨기베 람로 슈바레 제사다 상기 고바 토바라 아니 지 rinpo mātāpa, sāngyō kōpa tō tūgirē, sāyachī, ōndō shīne dīrīngi shī sōngyā dī ngā tsō dīrē tōwa, chī sā dīne zā ngā tsō dēndrī jeba chētā dī sōmbā nā chī ngā tsō kāsāntā dīrī shabā nā chī, dēndrī dāmbā ngā tsō dēndrā rākpa gyūndrī kī dēndrā samtā dīn mā tō shīne, dīne dēne tāpa dēndrī dī kī pōtū shīne ngā tsō jeba chēyā dī, nā kī chī mō chā kōrē. Sāstā dīrē.
To summarize what we've looked at this morning then, we've seen the need to meditate on all phenomena, coming to recognize that despite appearing as independent, they are dependent on causes and conditions. And not only are phenomena dependent on causes and conditions, we've also looked at how to reflect on mutual dependency on parts, and imputation by mind. So here I encourage you to meditate on the emptiness of the self and the aggregates and consciousness, and whatever phenomenon one is meditating on, utilize the same technique. Through the same technique, you'll come to recognize that when you investigate, when you seek an object, you cannot find the essence or the nature by which it appears to exist. It's empty of existing by such a nature or essence. It has no self-existence. And building on the meditation we looked at yesterday afternoon, take what you learned in this session and meditate with the technique of dependent arising on ever deeper levels, reflecting on dependency on causes, the relationship between phenomena, mutual dependency, as well as parts such as moments of consciousness, and dependence on imputation by mind. With all these techniques of analysis, we'll come to gain ever greater certainty that phenomena are dependent arisings. No phenomenon exists truly. And this we can liken then with the second line in our verse. And eventually, through meditating in this way, we come to realize emptiness, the third line, and then we enter the path that pleases the Buddhas. And the reason the Buddhas are delighted is because it's then that as bodhisattvas, we have now gained a realization of Buddhahood, that we are on the path to become Buddhas ourselves, and thereby fulfill the heartfelt wish of all the Buddhas. So we'll conclude there for this morning. Thank you, and we'll continue again this afternoon.